Hello and welcome to episode 13 of Courtside. I'm your host, Andrew Cohen. Courtside is a podcast dedicated to all things sports. In today's episode, I will talk about the Jimmy Butler trade, give my thoughts on Le'Veon Bell and the Steelers, and discuss the Washington Wizards. So sit back, relax, and take a seat. Courtside. So Jimmy Butler has been traded to the Philadelphia 76ers, along with young big man Justin Patton, in exchange for Robert Covington, a 3-and-D player, Dario Saric, a nice young big man, Jared Bayless, a veteran guard, and a 2022 second-round pick. And all I can say is just wow. I mean, just a week ago, everyone was talking about Jimmy Butler going to the Houston Rockets, and then all of a sudden, boom, he's headed to Philly. And then in addition, there are reports from ESPN that Butler and the 76ers are expected to work out a long-term contract next summer. So this is actually a move for the long term in Philly. And in my opinion, the Sixers are the big winners of this trade. You need superstars to be successful in the NBA. I think that's fairly obvious. A team's not going to win a championship if they don't have at least 2 stars, and sometimes you need 3. And the 76ers now have that elusive third star. By adding Butler to a team with Ben Simmons and Joel Embiid, I think the Sixers become a true competitor in what seems to now be a pretty strong top of the Eastern Conference. They're a team that can now compete with the Celtics, the Raptors, the Bucks. Now, of course, we'll have to see how everything comes together, but make no mistake, this team is going to be good. They're going to be very good, and I think they're going to be competing for a spot in the finals come playoff time. I think before this trade, there was a legitimate question mark whether they could even get into that Eastern Conference Finals. I think there still obviously is a question mark because of how good some of these teams are, but I feel much more confident that they could get to that point. And a big argument, and one argument that I was making before the year, was the Celtics beat them in 5 games. They almost swept the 76ers in 5 games without Kyrie and Hayward, and they got those guys back. And the 76ers more or less came back with the same roster, minus shooters like Marco Bellinelli and Ersan Ilyasova. So it was pretty clear to me that if those teams, if the Celtics and 76ers met up in the Eastern Conference semifinals or Eastern Conference finals, the Celtics were going to win that series. That's a little bit more unclear now. There's not as much of a level of certainty in that matchup now. Now for the Timberwolves side, I think this trade could actually be better than the original deal they supposedly had on the table from the Houston Rockets. I'm not too sure though. I think it could really go either way. Covington and Dario Saric are 2 guys that are way better than most of the players the team will end up drafting at the end of the first round. I think end of the first round picks in the NBA are pretty low percentage. There are a bunch of guys that you'll just never hear about, for the entirety of their NBA career. It could be short, they could be out of the league in just a few years. So considering Covington and Saric are 2 proven players, I do like that part of the trade for the Timberwolves. And also, the Rockets, I get every pick would have been every other year, so down the road, those picks could be really high. But, you're probably, at least for the first 2 picks, picking at the end of the first round. So I do like the upside that they're getting, the production they're going to get for Covington and Saric in the next couple of years. But overall, what I like about this trade from the Timberwolves is that it allows them to stay competitive for this year by adding 2 solid pieces in the mix with Karl-Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins. And then on top of that, you have Derrick Rose playing his best basketball, at least in my opinion, since his devastating knee injury, several years ago. So they still have a pretty good roster. I think the question mark will be, motivation, how much they really want to win, because that was one of the reasons Butler supposedly wanted out of Minnesota. So we'll see how that goes. But also, I just kind of want to talk about the Timberwolves' original trade for Jimmy Butler. They traded away Zach LaVine, who currently is averaging about 27 points per game this year. He's been unbelievable for Chicago, even though they're not winning games. They also traded away Chris Dunn, who looked pretty solid last year. He's currently hurt, so there's not much to talk about as far as this season for him. And they also traded the 7th overall pick in the draft last year, which ended up being Lauri Markkanen, who had a great rookie year, currently injured, so he'll be back in a couple weeks, and we'll see how he plays. But it kind of is crazy to me now, because at first when I saw that deal, I'm like, what are the Bulls doing? They got nothing in return for Butler. But actually, it looks like they got a pretty solid, pretty hefty return for a guy that didn't... I mean, he wanted to play in Chicago still, but a guy that with 2 years left on his contract, is probably going to leave when the contract was up. It kind of reminds me of the Paul George for Victor Oladipo trade, when at first you're just like, what are you doing? That's a terrible return when you could have gotten, a high first-round pick from the Celtics or, whatever the case may have been. And Oladipo ended up playing as good, if not better, than Paul George last year. Now, I'm not saying Zach LaVine's a better player than Jimmy Butler or Larry Markkanen's a better player than Jimmy Butler. What I'm saying, though, is it was a trade where you traded for a guy, in LaVine in this case, or Oladipo in the case of Paul George, where they didn't seem like they were going to be too good, and then all of a sudden they turned into a star. They turned into the number one option for their team. And the parallels between the two trades are interesting, and I kind of want to explore that further, maybe in future episodes of the podcast. But I just wanted to put that out there. So, again, overall, 76ers win this trade. Not a terrible trade from the Timberwolves side. So there have been some reports recently saying that Le'Veon Bell is not going to report to the Steelers this week by the Tuesday deadline, meaning he will not be eligible to play at all this season. Now listen, I'm all for players trying to get as much money as possible, and I can understand Le'Veon Bell's frustration with the Steelers organization in this specific situation, especially after the Todd Gurley deal that the Rams gave out last offseason. However, if this year has proven anything, it is that Le'Veon Bell needs the Steelers way more than the Steelers need him. For Pittsburgh, you're looking at a team that's currently 6-2-1, atop the AFC North, and at least for me, I have the Steelers as legitimate Super Bowl contenders in the NFL. And they're coming off a game where they absolutely obliterated the Panthers on national television. It was a complete embarrassment for the Panthers. Something like 2 touchdowns in 13 seconds and maybe, 3 touchdowns in 35 seconds. I don't know. I know the first one's correct. I don't know about the second one. Regardless, they have just been unbelievable since starting off. I think they started off 1-2-1. I mean, they've been unbelievable recently. And then you have James Conner, who's been amazing out of the backfield. And it really just doesn't look like the Steelers miss Bell at all. In fact, James Conner is not only matching what Bell has done, but he's actually, in some areas, exceeding what Bell has done. Last year, Bell averaged 4 yards per carry. Now, I will quickly say he did average 4.9 yards per carry each of the 2 years prior. But this year, James Conner is averaging 4.7 yards per carry. So, Conner is just as efficient as Bell running the football, if not more efficient, going off of the 2017 season for Bell. Now, one of the biggest things for Le'Veon Bell is that he's a great receiver out of the backfield, one of the best receiving running backs in the entire league, right? He had 85 catches for 755 yards and 2 touchdowns last year. I think it was 755? Yeah, okay. No, sorry, 655 yards and 2 touchdowns last year. Then you have Conner, who's on pace for 78 catches for 774 yards and 2 touchdowns this season. So Conner is actually more efficient than the, quote, receiving back, Le'Veon Bell. And then the biggest thing, for me, at least, is Bell's career high for rushing touchdowns, and I'm sure you guys have heard this stat a lot. Bell's career high for rushing touchdowns in a single season is 9, which came in 2017. Conner already has 10 in half the amount of games in 2018. So long story short, Conner is arguably a better player than Le'Veon Bell. He's also significantly cheaper because he's on a rookie contract. So it makes no reason for the Steelers to keep Le'Veon Bell. Right? So of course this basically means the end of Le'Veon Bell's Steelers career. And think about it this way for Bell. His entire career, he has benefited from having a great quarterback in Ben Roethlisberger, some great receivers in Antonio Brown. Right now you have Juju Smith-Schuster, you had Emmanuel Sanders. He's also had a fairly good offensive line for the entirety of his career. There's no guarantee that any or all of those things will be in place wherever he goes next. For example, there were reports earlier in the year about the Jets wanting to trade for Bell. Now, of course, I'm not saying Bell is going to sign with the Jets because who would sign with the New York Jets? But think about it. They have a young, unestablished quarterback in Sam Darnold. an average at best receiving core led by Quincy Enunwa, Jermaine Kearse, and Robbie Anderson, and they have a shaky O-line that's maybe one of the worst in the National Football League. But let's say Bell signs with, I don't know, Aaron Rodgers and the Green Bay Packers. Unlike the Jets, they have one of the greatest quarterbacks of all time, some great receivers in Devontae Adams, Randall Cobb. They have some other young guys stepping up this year. They also have a really good offensive line. However, they already have a young and talented running back in Aaron Jones, who I'm not sure, at the time of recording this, Sunday night, he's coming off a game today where he had, I think it was 130 yards and 2 touchdowns against the Dolphins. He's averaging well over 5 yards per carry. Coming into today, he was averaging 6 yards per carry heading into today. The league best. I'm pretty sure that went up with his performance today, so he's been unbelievable. There's no reason to believe that Green Bay would go and spend a ton of money on a guy in Bell that they don't necessarily need. And to be quite honest with you, Green Bay is known for being pretty cheap when it comes to players outside of Aaron Rodgers. So, again, for Bell, don't expect Bell to necessarily get this huge contract from a really good team. Don't expect him to be nearly as good next year as he was with the Steelers, because wherever he goes, the offense is most likely not going to be as good as it was in Pittsburgh, and it's the James Conner era now in Pittsburgh. The Wizards are sitting at 3-9 and would be in last place in the Eastern Conference if it were not for the dumpster fire that is the Cleveland Cavaliers. Regardless, though, this Wizards team is bad, and it's not going to get any better. Now, I will say this. The Wizards also started off 3-9 in 2016, and they ended up making it to Game 7 of the Eastern Conference Finals, where they lost to Isaiah Thomas and the Boston Celtics. But things are much different compared to how they were back then. The biggest thing being that Otto Porter was not being paid upwards of $25 million. And let me just say this. If there's one type of team that every front office wants to avoid, it's the type of team that is a luxury taxpayer and is losing games. The Wizards this season, luxury taxpayer, losing games. Not good. However, the worst part of it is, it's not just a one-year problem. In fact, it looks like this is going to be at least a 2-year problem. Again, you have Otto Porter making over $25 million per year over the next 2 years. And then he has a player option for $28 million in 2020. The worst part about this deal for the Wizards is it could have been completely avoided, because the Nets were actually the team to originally sign him to a 4-year, $106 million contract a couple years ago. And for some just idiotic reason, the Wizards decided to match the contract offered to the restricted free agent Porter. And listen, even my 14-year-old self knew that was a bad move. Like, there are just some moves aren't going to work. Brock Osweiler to the Texans being one of them. This being another. You just know they're not going to work. And for some idiotic reason, the team does it anyways. Then you have Bradley Beal. Fairly decent contract considering he's an all-star caliber player. Making over $25 million for each of the next 3 years. And he's on just a whole nother level compared to Porter, yet they're making the same amount of money. Think about that. Then you have John Wall, making the least money out of Washington's supposed big three this season. There's a catch, however. This year he's making only $19 million, which for his services is a pretty solid deal. But next year, his big extension kicks in, and his salary will double to about $38 million. Whew. Then his salary is going to increase every year until he makes $47 million in 2022. That's right. $47 million for John Wall. He's going to be a complete logjam for this franchise in the coming years. And finally, let me just throw this guy in. Jan Mahinmi, a backup center who the Wizards are paying $16 million to each of the next 2 years. And by the way, the original contract was 4 years, $16 million per. A couple years ago they gave this to him because he averaged like 9 points and a few rebounds with the Pacers coming off the bench. Unbelievably bad contract at the time as well. Anybody could have seen this coming. Terrible player. He's putting up huge numbers this year, though, with 4 points per game and 3.6 rebounds. And he's actually been starting because Dwight Howard has been out with a butt injury. So, God, he's bad. So let's play a little GM. There are a few moves I think the Wizards could make that would vastly improve their team going forward. And yes, in some of these cases, the Wizards will sacrifice some wins in the coming years. However, the payoff will be they'll be a vastly better team down the road. Now let's start off with the first move I have. And this is the move I think the Wizards should try to make first before they try to make any other move. And that's trading Otto Porter. Now to me, this is the trade that the Wizards should prioritize over any other move they could possibly make. As I've mentioned twice already, Otto Porter is signed to a terrible contract, making $25 million plus per year for the next few years, and it's just bad. Now let me be clear. Porter's not a scrub. Right? He can play a little bit. He's good on the defensive end. He's a decent offensive player. He's a good, solid three-point shooter, although he's having a down year offensively. But he's clearly just not worth the money the Wizards are paying him. It's a huge overpay. It's a clear overpay from the Wizards. Plus, the Wizards are going to need some cap room if they want to turn their franchise around, so trading one of their big contracts is a must. There is one problem with trying to trade Porter, though. Every other team in the league knows he's signed to a bad contract and aren't going to be willing to part with much besides another bad contract and maybe a draft pick in exchange for Porter. However, if the Wizards can find a way to trade Porter away for a bad expiring contract at worst, I think it would be a win. To me, the ideal trade here would be you trade away Porter, right, bad contract for another bad contract, but hopefully a bad contract that has fewer years left on it. I think that would be your ideal trade for Porter. I think, though, considering he's having a slight down year, at least to begin the year, and his contract is bad, it's going to be hard to move him. But if the Wizards they can start to turn their franchise around. So the second move that the Wizards should try to make is to trade away Bradley Beal. And let me be completely transparent here. They should only make this trade if they're unable to trade away Porter, which should be their first priority, but is also going to be pretty tough to do, as I mentioned. However, it's going to be way easier to trade Bradley Beal, which is good news for the Wizards. And in addition, the Wizards 100% would get a better return in exchange for Beal than they would for Porter. Now, on the surface, you would think the best chance Washington has to trade Beal would be to find a team that lacks three-point shooting or just scoring in general and making a trade. How about a team like Oklahoma City, the league's worst three-point shooting team? I think they shoot, last time I checked, like 28%. Holy, it's just bad. They are bricking threes all over the place. Seems like a perfect fit for Bradley Beal, considering they need some shooting. But the Thunder have the second highest payroll in the league, and they already have 3 guys slated to make at least $24 million for each of the next 3 years in Russell Westbrook, Paul George, and Steven Adams. 3 guys that, in all honesty, are deserving of the money they're getting paid. Steven Adams, I don't know too much about that, but he has proven to be a core member of that team. And then also you have Dennis Schroeder making $15 million each of the next 3 seasons, and of course if you're trading Beal, it doesn't make sense to take back Schroeder because he's going to be a backup point guard making $15 million behind a guy that's going to be making $40+ million. However, here's one potential landing spot for Beal, and I'm not too sold on this one, but this is just one I saw in a couple minutes of thinking about it. But the Dallas Mavericks. Now, the Mavericks have a pair of young studs in Luka Doncic and Dennis Smith Jr. Everybody knows that. But outside of those two, it seems like the Mavericks would be willing to move anyone. I mean, probably not Dirk, obviously, but for example, let's take Wesley Matthews. Right? For the Wizards, Matthews he presents an expiring contract, making $18 million, but an expiring contract that the Wizards would be able to get off the books after this year. For the Mavericks, though, he's playing his best basketball since he signed in Dallas, and he's also an expiring contract, which is great value for them. So if the Mavericks wanted to bolster their roster for a potential playoff run, it could make some sense and try to put together a deal for Beal. Oh, that kind of rhymes. But I'm not sure it would necessarily work out I think they like Matthews in that system, a nice 3-and-D player. But that's just one potential landing spot because I did kind of want to present that. And finally, move 3, and you could probably predict it at this point, but the final move I think the Wizards could try and make is to trade away John Wall. Now, of course, this move would mean a complete overhaul of the organization, but that may just be what the Wizards need. Of course, Wall is a great all-star caliber player, but the Wizards have not made it past the second round of the playoffs since drafting him, and if they don't shake up their roster soon, they may not even get to the second round in the near future with talented teams like Boston, Milwaukee, Toronto, and Philadelphia. And actually, listen to these numbers for John Wall. These are John Wall's numbers in Washington's final game of the Eastern Conference semifinals in each of the last 3 times they got there. 2013, 2014 against the Pacers. Elimination game. 12 points. He was a minus 11. He did not show up. Against the Hawks, 2014, 2015. This was the year Paul Pierce played for the Wizards and hit that game-winning shot, and then almost hit the game-tying shot in Game 6, but they lost Game 6. Wall scored 20 points on 33% shooting. Oh, jeez. I think he's like 7 for 21. I mean, he was a walking brick. And then 2016, 2017 against the Celtics. I alluded to this way earlier at the beginning of this. But he had 18 points and shot just 35% from the field. Also, if my memory serves me correctly, he had like 2 total points in the fourth quarter. It was a bad game. Now, of course, these stats are not to show that John Wall is a bad player, because he is not a bad player. He's a really good player. But these stats do in part show that the games in which the Wizards have needed him the most, he has not delivered. And when a player does not deliver in big games, in big moments, when the team really needs him, he's not worth $40+ million a year. And that's the problem the Wizards are faced with. Once again, the common problem for the Wizards in their attempt to make a trade like this is the money they owe John Wall. And I would doubt there's any team out there, save for maybe an idiotic organization like the Magic or the Knicks, that would want to trade for Wall and his huge, monstrous contract. However, if the Wizards are able to move him, first of all, it would be a miracle. But secondly, they would get a significant haul, and when mixed in with Bradley Beal, because they would still have Bradley Beal in this scenario, they could actually create a pretty strong team moving forward. Thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode of Courtside. Join me next time where I'll discuss more of the biggest storylines in sports and maybe do another edition of Sports Theory. And as usual, remember to subscribe to the podcast on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you may be listening. And don't forget to follow the Courtside Podcast on Twitter. Link will be in the description. Signing off, this is Andrew Cohen. I will see you next time.